Hello, I'm Christabel and I'm continuing showing you, this is part 2, a diagram that I've been using in my work when I've been working with people who have trauma in their life. The previous diagram was the feelings jar. This one I call the pseudo-adult diagram, and it goes like this. When we're small, we're physically and socially and emotionally small. And then our bodies grow and we look and talk and act like grown-ups. However, if things have gone wrong in our lives, and there's no one who's had a perfect childhood, parts of us can stay stuck at the age we were when that happened to us. And that part I call the emotional child or the inner child. And this part I call the pseudo-adult. Now, pseudo can be a funny word. It might mean pretend or fake. I don't mean it that way. I mean it looks, talks, and acts like an adult, but under stress and under, funnily enough, the sort of negative conditions that might have impacted on them as children, instead of an adult response, out comes a child response. And when I was working with men in the prison who had committed murder, I discovered that often the emotional state they were in when they committed that murder was very similar to a 2-year-old child having a tantrum. We all know that when a 2-year-old has a tantrum, they don't mind who they hurt, themselves or anybody else. They just want to get rid of whatever it is they're upset about. And we know how to handle 2-year-old children. We comfort them, we give them structure until they calm down. However, if you've got a 2-year-old going wild in a big grown-up body with maybe a broken bottle or a knife in their hand, that's when murder can happen. And so that's what I learned about how behaviour that comes from an adult can actually be coming from an earlier time in their life. And I actually don't think we get any angrier than when we're 2 years old, because we really know that we're upset and we want that threat to go. We don't have any empathy of how other people might feel, and we don't particularly care. And that's what happens in adult life when out comes the childlike behaviour. And when I'm working in Aboriginal communities, they say to me, "Oh, we see this kind of behaviour all the time. We call it kid brain." And you're being childish, because instead of the grown-up that we're expecting, out comes very childish behaviour. And of course that happens to all of us. So I ask people to think about what are the things that happen in people's lives that aren't helpful for children. And the 3 most serious things that can happen to a child are sexual abuse, or physical abuse or emotional abuse or mental abuse. Exposure to violence, seeing parents angry can be the most frightening thing for a child. And then even more harmful to a child than either of those is neglect. Because when you think about it, sexual abuse and violence are relationships gone wrong, but neglect is when a child doesn't have a relationship and doesn't have anyone to relate to. But as well as these serious things, and they are the most serious things that can happen that cause trauma in childhood and cause the little part of us to stay stuck, there's other things that are simpler and easier to understand, like death, grief or loss. Often the death of a pet can impact on a child even more than the death of an adult, because they're used to adults coming and going, so they don't necessarily know that there's been a loss there. But when a pet that they're very close to dies, they do know that there's loss. So grief and loss, illness, something as simple as shifting from one country to another can be very traumatic, because you lose loved caregivers and friends. So moving country, and for Aboriginal people, stolen generation grief is a very deep thing when children were taken away. Other things I'm sure you can think of, like bullying or racism and illness, I've said that, accidents, things that happen in our lives. Now, the thing to understand about that is when I did the feelings jar, I said when things happen to us as children, we put it inside, we act like it hasn't happened, and it works fine. So if we look at the feelings jar from the top, if something bad happens to a child, it's kind of survival response to block it out and pretend it hasn't happened. However, if it happens again, the child doesn't think, oh, that bad thing's happening again. They just lock it away because they can't remember having had it. And if the jar starts filling up with all these incidents that are locked away, it gets to the point where it's no longer a healthy survival response, as it is in childhood. It becomes an unhealthy, dysfunctional response because too much of the psychological energy is taken keeping these feelings out of the person's mind, and they've got less energy to engage in relationships with other people, and also things happen out there that are similar to things that have been locked away, and starts leaking out. Now, when I was working with women who were adult survivors of child sexual abuse, often I discovered they'd come to me and they'd say, I haven't thought about this for 15 years, and now it's suddenly in my face, I feel like I'm going crazy. And I'd say to them, you're not going crazy, you're going sane. It's actually crazier to keep it all locked away. The fact that something has reminded you of that and you're now remembering it is a sign that you're saying to yourself, I couldn't bear to look at this before, but I can now. And it's important for healing to let it out. And often the trigger that would release these memories would be either they got married or they had a child who was the same gender, a girl, or their child reached the age they were when they were abused, and suddenly back would come those memories that they had locked away. And so when I was working with them, I found it very important to hear their story and to hear what was happening to them, because I knew that parts of them had been locked away, and it's actually not that that part of them is irreversibly damaged, it's that it's been locked away and they don't want to know it exists. So as a therapist, when I'm working with people, and this is me over here, I don't worry about the adult. I know that the adult person is doing the best they can. I go looking for the hurt and damaged child. And what I do is I do the opposite of what the person's doing. Instead of locking it away, pretending it doesn't exist, and then being embarrassed when it breaks out, and then locking it away again, I give it recognition. I know to go looking for it, and acceptance. Now, that doesn't mean I accept the behaviour that comes from it. As I said, sometimes that behaviour can be violent. Often sexual offending against a child comes from that inner child that's been damaged. So I don't accept the behaviour that comes, but I accept that it wouldn't be happening unless something pretty serious had gone wrong in the person's life and it was locked away. Now, that in itself can be very comforting because a counsellor who listens and looks at one's childhood and understands why some of the behaviours have come. And I might use this illustration here. One of the reasons that I was very pleased with my work with women who were adult survivors of child sexual abuse was that I'd worked with men who'd offended against children. And what I discovered was that it wasn't the adult that had offended against the child, it was the damaged child in that adult. And often the age of the victim in sexual abuse and what they had done told me more about where they were stuck than they could actually tell me, because usually the age of the victim was slightly older than the age when they were damaged and had things happen to them. So that in itself, of having a counsellor who understands that, is comforting and helpful. However, it's not transformative. The only thing that's transformative is when the person himself or herself starts copying how I look at their inner child. And instead of locking it away and leaving that painful experience unacknowledged so that it can burst out at any time, they actually recognise and accept it. At that point, healing can happen, and that inner child can grow. And it can't catch up from, say, 8 years old to 40 years old overnight. It might take a while. But as they start understanding why they've acted the way they have, then suddenly they start growing up. And so something else can come along, and instead of acting like an adult, out can come still a childish response, but at a slightly older age. And then the person thinks, oh, what's wrong with me? I should be over this now. I've had all this counselling, and they lock it away again, and it stays stuck there, where in fact they have to say, what's this about? And unlock some of the unacknowledged pain from their childhood that they hadn't even recognised before. And the end point of that process is what I call the true adult. And if you think about it, the only true adult you can get is the grown-up child. And the true adult looks exactly like the pseudo-adult because it's your age and it's in your body. And it's got your childhood because nobody else can have your childhood. But the true adult is a bit like an umpire. It integrates some of the childish feelings and hurts and wounds and desires, or the punitive pseudo-adult saying, I'm not good enough, I should have been better than this. The adult acts like an umpire and determines how best to organise that person. So healing happens in that way. So that is my pseudo-adult diagram, and it's my explanation of how people need to heal and recognise their unacknowledged pain from childhood to prevent themselves being in a situation where suddenly it might be triggered and out comes a childlike response that is actually unhelpful and negative, and often violence happens that way, and fighting, but also offending happens in that way too. And often in married couples, people will recognise that sometimes they think they're being two adults together, but sometimes they're being like two kids fighting with each other. So that's my pseudo-adult diagram, and we'll have a pause now.